even more international because we have a guest from Australia, John Kinsella, who is a poet, an activist, a writer of many genres, a resident of a particular part of the western side of Australia, and someone who frequently collaborates with other writers in various shapes and forms and across different genres. And today he's going to be talking to us about one such collaboration, and is currently here in the English department as a visiting professor, sponsored by the DAD, and will be here until March, April, at the tail end of, so this is the tail end of 2 years of teaching in the department, one of which, because of COVID, was online. Officially, he's affiliated with the with Churchill College, which is part of the University of Cambridge in the UK, also with several universities in Western Australia, has taught different points in different places around the world, most prominently for many years at Kenyon College in Ohio, which is one of the places where his particular discipline, craft, academic area, which is teaching creative writing, was actually invented as an academic pursuit. And all these things, I think you'll see them coming together around the sort of the core area of environmental activism and environmental concern and care on the one hand, on the other side of the coin, destruction in what we'll be talking about today, linked up to the what for people from Australia and from many other parts of the world is another crucial issue, which is the issue of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices, and Indigenous political struggles. Okay, thanks, John. I'll shut up and let you take over.
Yep, and I assume everyone has access to that PDF that I provided. Yeah. So what I suggest is that I'll refer to it, and if you can look at the relevant sheets as we go, might be useful. I'll give you a bit of background first about what I'm doing. This session's called Yarning with Charmaine Papertalk-Green. Charmaine Papertalk-Green is a bio note in the PDF. I'll just give you a brief summation of it from her Red Room page. That's an organisation in Australia that facilitates poetic kind of projects. She was born in Urdu. Charmaine is a proud Wajiri, Badamaya, a Wilanya woman of the Yamaji Nation. Those of you not familiar with what that area is, if you think of the west coast of Australia, Western Australia, and the town of Geraldton, that's the colonial imposition, that's the area of her people and peoples. So I'm going to be talking about working with Charmaine, an incredibly generous collaborator with whom I've worked with for quite a number of years, produced these 2 books, False Claims to Colonial Thieves and Art. And what we talk about in our collaboration are 2 fundamental things. First of all, the issues of straightforward colonialism. I come from a settler colonial background. My family escaped the Irish famine and British persecution to become colonisers themselves in the mid-19th century in Western Australia. And that disjunction has driven a lot of my research and work over the years on how to best redress, address, and rectify these issues by association. But they're not just by association, they're also a direct culpability to my mind. Where I write in Western Australia is on Balladong Noongar land, near Budges countries. I went to school on Charmaine's country up at Geraldton. I went to high school there. So really a conversation not only takes place between someone who's First Nations, whose connections to country go back to Barna in the Yamaji sense, go back to 40, 50, 60,000 years, where there's a conversation with someone whose antecedents are mid-19th century Irish. not exclusively, but largely Irish. So you get this disjunction of presence, someone who's living on their country that's been stolen from them. The whole process of colonial dispossession is something that informs everything Charmaine writes, and her standing as advocate and representative of her people in terms of discussing this loss, acting for her community, acting in consultation with her community, and speaking proudly on behalf of the incredible cultural and other knowledges of her people. On the other hand, I live on stolen country. I acknowledge this, and I see it as my responsibility to rectify, as I said, in any way I can. Now, how can this happen? That's really the discussion that we have. And I think it's an important discussion because they're not commonly had in public, and certainly not in literature, because for obvious reasons, because of the whole kind of cultural privileging that goes on with colonial discourse, and the fact that colonized voices are inevitably marginalized, even when they are able to find a voice or a way to speak in the broader colonial structure. They still have to negotiate so many different oppressions that are embodied in governance. So I think what we do has some relevance. It is, Charmaine calls it a yarn. Yeah. And one of the links I provided at the beginning of, in the opening sheet of the attachment of the PDF you have, is a wonderful article by Janine Lean that talks about not talking about what we do as collaboration, but talking it about something else, as yarning, as a kind of conversation. And that's what this is. So what I'm going to be doing today is the second thing, is addressing how our conversation is affected by the destruction of environment by mining companies. Ostensibly, what we're doing is talking about art, largely, and the way we both perceive art, and the way we both use art. But that is always an inflection of the pressures taking place around Indigenous country, especially from mining companies, and obviously pastoral concerns and land development and so on. So two sets of poems primarily are going to be read. The first set is about our grandmothers, the differences in our kind of heritage, and strangely, some overlaps in the sense that both were affected in different ways by mining activity. In Charmaine's case, well, you'll hear her speak. I have her permission to read her work and discuss it. There's always a process of consultation and permission that goes on with all this work. We know each other well, but I would no sooner read her work, even if I've had permission to do it before, without getting permission again. It's been granted for this occasion, and that's as is appropriate to my mind. So grandmothers, but my grandmother, or my maternal grandmother, grew up in the goldfields of Western Australia. She was born and grew up in a place called Kukaini, right out past Kalgoorlie. Her father, my great-grandfather, was the mining foreman of something called the South Champion Mine, a gold mine. He eventually died of what they call dust on the lungs, or miner's disease, from mining. So my heritage of mining is one of death, but it's also one of imposition and colonial imposition. Our grandmothers are positioned very differently, but they are still our grandmothers, and that's the conversation that we develop. The second long sequence of poems I'm going to be reading is called an art yarn, where we talk about the different ways we perceive art functioning, how we perceive art to function in the world, how it does or doesn't represent the concerns we're talking about, and where the clash of Indigenous art practice and European Eurocentric art practice, where they meet and what their collisions are, especially in terms of so-called landscape painting and representing non-Indigenous colonial interaction with Australian spatialities. This will all become evident as we go along. So I'm going to start. Oh, there's a photo, incidentally, in your handout, a colour photo. I've just got this in black and white of myself and Charmaine sitting at her place up near Geraldton, for those of you interested. Okay, so this is from the first set of poems I'm going to read, Grandmothers, is from the book False Claims of Colonial Thieves. You'll tell from the title that it's a book already trying to say right from the outset that this is a case of overt theft that's never been rectified, and we are going to engage with some kind of process towards rectification. So Grandmothers. Now, each of these poems is initialed underneath. So I'm JK, and obviously Charmaine Papertalk-Green is CPG. So I start this sequence, and then the next poem will be by Charmaine, and so on. So this is called Grandmothers. My grandmother was a mining town child, Kukaini, where her father was foreman of the South Champion mine. My father worked for decades in Karratha and Kell, so it's not as if I come to the mines without foreknowledge, but I can only see them as the harrowing of hell, the opening of the land to release what shouldn't be released, a desecration of spirit and place. This is no small-scale intrusion for the sake of community, but open slather, a ripping out, an extraction to fuel the world's end. Now, Charmaine. My grandmother washed white town fellas' clothes to feed her kids and survive. I don't think mining would have meant much to her when trying to survive on the fringes of the Mullawa township she had passed on by the time Western mining started destroying country. Out past Morrow Way, I saw the rail wagons as a kid rolling on Maley Street carrying Kulanuka iron ore, not understanding what this meant or where this country was going or why they wanted this country. I was just a kid watching trains. Now me. My grandmother's home is gone now, though plaques with her words, her memories, stand among the tailings. She would tell me the story of her father lost in the desert being saved by an elder and Afghan cameleer. As a child, I was obsessed with this story, and it made the dry spaces lush and hopeful. In my great-grandmother's delirium, grandfather's delirium, he heard the many voices of the desert, knew the dry surface was only one truth, that deep below when they dug, the waters of the desert flooded the shafts. Nothing was as it seemed to him, his workers. He knew the language he couldn't understand was so complex it was drawn out of the rock, the plants, the very essence of the ground he was robbing. And then the miner's disease got his lungs and he died in the hills outside Perth, a long way from his understanding, a long way from where I think he started to know. Those of us with colonizers as ancestors look for ways to retell their stories, to build hope. But the fact is, in the railway, the ore crushers, the shafts sunk into country. My grandmother told me many stories of the desert, of flowers and birds on the edges. I am free to retell her stories. She made no claim. She let them grow. I own none of them. She told me she watched the black fellas through the Hessian curtains, watched them go out past the town limits, out past the claims, out beyond the furthest wanderings of the prospectors, out where there was a truth she knew was so close to home, if only she understood how to see. And finally, Charmaine. There were no Nana Alice stories. Mum didn't talk lots about Nana. I think it hurt too much for my mum to even utter her mother's name. It was not allowed in those days. When someone died, their name died. At least the native welfare files kind of brought Nana Alice to life. Nana was 42 when she died. I sat at her grave in Geraldton whispering secrets to a Nana, telling her stories of country, her descendants and their lives. I am glad the only mining she would have ever known was from the rich ochre on her body and in her hair during the ceremony time out on country. Okay, one grandmother directly involved in the colonial project of mining, even though she was a child. She watched things happening around her. She passed the stories of it on to later generations, my mother, myself, so on. Charmaine's Nana, who died at a very young age, actually didn't know about the mining that Charmaine knows of. And yet it profoundly affects everything around her life. It's the loss of country. It's the theft of the materials of country. It's the theft of knowledge and data, as Charmaine would call the theft of the sovereignty of data. Okay. Then we have those final lines about the mining she knows is the ochre she painted her body with during ceremonies. That ochre that's a form of mining too, but a very, 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 very minimalist version of mining, one that doesn't devastate country, one that doesn't destroy biosphere, one where country and person are intimately connected, so they're almost indissoluble. Very different versions of mining, and they're reflected through these tales of a grandmother who was absent, and a grandmother who, for me, was present. And that has its own dynamic as well in the colonial kind of structure. The next sequence I'm going to read, actually, before I read the long yarning sequence, I'm going to interrupt with, you'll find on your Moodle an image. Yours is in colour. And it's an incredible painting by Shane Pickett, a Noongar, West Australian Noongar artist born in a town called Quairading. And this painting is called Moonlight Medicines and Healing Waterfall, 2008. And the book art is largely an engagement with Shane Pickett's incredible art. And you'll find plenty of it online. I've given links at the beginning of the PDF. And also a discussion of art practice and conversations around some of Charmaine's art as well, because she's quite a prominent artist, both in her community and in Australia as a whole. So this remarkable picture is the stimulus for two poems I'm going to read before the next long sequence. And they're anti-ekphrastic poems. Necessarily, for me to write about Indigenous Australian art, even art from the country that I live on, the stolen country I inhabit, is complex and can't be done, to my mind, without a whole set of protocols in place. And those protocols took place. Consultation, he's deceased now, so consultation with his family, that kind of thing. And there's a straightforward, so when you hear the words I read, you've got to understand them in the context of someone who deeply believes that all Indigenous country in Australia should be returned. I'm not speaking, I just want to make this clear so people actually understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying allowing a bit of representation or to have some country said to be one's traditional lands, quotation marks, returned. I'm talking about complete return. I mean totally. Then everyone living there who's not Indigenous is in consultation with the owners on how they can live there. So, you know, I'm a very, very pro-migration person, highly pro-refugee person, and I believe in a cosmopolitan community in every way. But I also believe that when you've got a theft, a grand theft, like has happened in Australia, that total control of that country needs to be returned to its people, the Indigenous people of Australia, and then they talk about how we all negotiate our relationship with place and so on, and we work through them and consult. So I come from that position. So these two poems, the first poem is mine, and it's called On Shane Pickett's Moonlight Medicines and Healing Waterfall. The basic premise of it is, as I look up into the night sky, where I live at Jamtree Gully in Western Australia, out in the Western Australian wheat belt in the bush, I look up, I don't think all of those stars are mine, because stars are everyone's. I don't think that. I look up and think, these are Noongar stars, and how I see them is actually conditional. I often think of the stars you can't see. They might be mine. I can't see them. The light's too faint. They might be, in some way, quotation marks mine. As an anarchist, I don't believe in any property or ownership of anything. So, figuratively speaking. Okay. So it's an odd thing. I look at these things. I worry about the country I'm on because there's been no agreement about my being there. I look at the night sky and I don't feel it can be quotation marks mine. But that's not a problem for me. I'm glad it can't be mine. I don't want it to be mine. I just want to understand it. I want to understand it without appropriating or stealing it. I want it to be. I look at the painting by Shane Pickett. I look at the painting on the Budjar it was created on Balladong Budjar. So this was actually probably painted on Wajak Budjar, which is Perth, but it's a Noongar Nation Budjar land, country. And so all these things are going on in my mind. So I'm not trying to analyze the painting in my Euro-critical kind of aesthetic, in my case, anti-aesthetic process. I'm trying to negotiate what it is in terms of how I'm looking at it and why I'm looking at it and the privilege under which I'm looking at it. So there's a whole different experience taking place there. Now for Charmaine, and we'll hear her poem second, there are also complexities because nothing's ever straightforward. Being Indigenous doesn't mean immediate access to all Indigenous peoples. The 250, many of which are lost through colonisation and erasure, 250 Indigenous languages in Australia at the time of colonisation. And we're talking many different peoples. And this kind of blanking people into one is quite disturbing. And it's, you know, this is the non-decolonising stuff we're dealing with constantly. So when Charmaine, as a Yamaji person of the Yamaji Nation, looks at a piece of Noongar art, she's also negotiating across peoples, across countries. And she has her own ways of doing that. She has family connections. She also goes through consultation process, very different from my own because it's not a colonial consultation. It's one of mutual conversation about moving from one country to another. It's not something I can explain or talk about. I do not, for a moment, purport to understand, represent, or speak for Indigenous peoples on any level. That is not my right, nor do I ever feel I will ever be in a position where I can. Well, I can talk about the position I come from in the way we interact. So we've got Charmaine, myself, and this piece of art, or these pieces of art. So there's a whole set of negotiations taking place in that interaction. So here's my poem, and then I will read Charmaine's. And mine, as I said, is called On Shane Pickett's Moonlight Medicines and Healing Waterfall, which he did in 2008, not long before he passed away. I don't go near stars that aren't mine. I don't go near their stories and origins. I can hear the moonlight plashing down the granite sluices in the valley below, and I see the reflections of the Milky Way in the sheen of rocks in difficult to get to places. I am sad as I study the pattern of your stories again and can't help looking for medicine, which is a splash of red from galactic fusion. And I make sequences which might do me some good, or I might just be taking a placebo while the real healing is to leave off searching for a cure for myself and let the stars heal night, cure daylight, guide their followers. I can't go near the stars that aren't mine. I won't get near their stories and origins. And this is Charmaine's response to the same painting. And she's going through all her different kind of conditions of relationship and association and difference and so on. Moon and water healing. The moon fascinates when it shines so bright at night, waking up the land in an ethereal way that even the birds don't sleep, and those who are afraid of the dark can feel a healing and comfort in this moonlight. The stars belong to no one, and yet they can belong to all. A personal star story can be wrapped around your neck, but don't steal cultural star or moon stories from others, because the sky world is generous and offers the night sky with its jewelry box of sparkling lights lifting the spirits, and the dotted line straight through to the eye of the receiver. And on Earth, when the night sky overwhelms, then look for still waters capturing the reflection from above. Shane Pickett's Moonlight Medicine and Healing Waterfalls reminds that night darkness is not to be feared because the moon dust, moonbeams, and moon rays are the healing, like waterfalls dropping down soft waves onto country while we sleep and capture the dreams of our ancestors sent to us as gifts so that we can dream for our descendants. Healing. In that poem, a couple of really important kind of sensibilities. First of all, the stars are all, sure, but don't steal cultural star or moon stories from others. And this is the basic issue of the ongoing colonialism in Australia. It underwrites all the land theft and all the kind of inequality and all the bigotry, and that country is rife with. It's an apartheid country. Australia is an apartheid country. It is. It may not officially be, but in reality, in so many ways, it is. But what she's saying here is, let's share, but don't steal what is ours. Don't steal the very essence of who we are and our belonging to those stars and the stories of how they came into being. If we're reflecting further onto an ecological positioning in this discussion, and as an ecological activist, as an environmental activist, a lot of my time in life has been spent trying to stop forests being bulldozed over and stop mines and these kind of things. You know, I'm talking about feet on the ground, getting out there, trying to stop the horror. These poems are about that. These poems are about it because what we're mapping in them, or demapping as I would prefer to say, we look at mapping as a kind of colonial enterprise, this is a demapping exercise, or unmapping. You can find essays I've written on these difference between demapping and unmapping if you're remotely interested, is what we're talking about is if you disrespect knowledge of place, stories of place, and people's rights to those, you're necessarily going to be indifferent to how the actual physical environment's being treated because you don't totemically or otherwise identify with that country. It's very easy for a mining company to knock a forest over. It's very easy indeed. There's no, ultimately for the company, there may be individuals in the company who have a relationship to that country. There's no reason why an Indigenous person's not working for a mining company. In fact, there are many cases where it is so. But the overall philosophy of the structure of a mining company, the whole kind of capitalist imperial push of mining companies and their kind of trajectory through modern history is very, very much about making a gap, increasing the width between cause and effect, between what chopping a tree down does to you and your community personally. It is sold as not affecting you because what comes from the mine will be far better for your lives, will give you more. And it completely cuts off that connection with the natural space. Okay, so now we're going to just shift to the long sequence that I mentioned before. This is a long sequence called Art Yarn. Just a bit of background. You'll find at the back of your PDF a number of paintings. The first one you'll find is Captain Sterling's Exploring Party 50 Miles Up the Swan River by W.J. Huggins, painted in 1827. So Captain Sterling was exploring the so-called quotation marks Swan River, because there were black swans on the river and it was given that name. It's obviously not its indigenous name. And the landscape painting you will find there is very characteristic of that particular period of British imperial exploration paintings, situating the quotation marks, natives in one corner, the wildlife in the other. You're all familiar with the kind of symbol and codifications of these kind of paintings. The next two, I should note that 1827 was 2 years prior to the founding of the colony. So it's a pre-official document, which is interesting in all sorts of ways in its implications. Today's not the time to talk about that, though it is suggested in the poems I'm about to read. The next two paintings, one is Hans Hyson's Droving into the Light, which was painted between 1914 and 1921. He originally started in South Australia in 1914, but he went and revised it and so on. It wasn't actually shown to the public until 1921, if I remember rightly, somewhere around there. It's an archetypal Australian colonial motif. You've got the stock rider, if you like, riding between these are South Australian great river red gums, riding into the diffused landscape with sheep around, and there's a kind of mournful hunch in the rider, carrying the weight of colonial burden on his shoulders of opening up the country, and it's got a wistful, nostalgic sadness to it. Classic piece of propaganda. The next painting is actually a copy, pretty close to perfect in many ways, but in other ways quite different. My grandfather made in the 1930s. This painting went into the Art Gallery of Western Australia. And my grandfather, who was a signwriter artist, used to sit in the gallery copying paintings. And he was incredibly good. He was so good that in the 1950s, this is true. In the 1950s, there was an exhibition of modern art, which he loathed because he was really conservative. And we'll get to his conservatism in a minute. I was very close to him, but our politics were like, opposites. He loathed modern art. And there was an exhibition in which some of the masters of European modern art were on display, including a Picasso of great worth. And he so loathed it that he went and painted in his garden shed a picture which he called Nude in Repose. And if he did it now, of course, he'd be jailed for 20 years. He went and removed the Picasso from the art gallery. There's no security. Put it in the janitor's closet and put his Nude in Repose up there and left it stay there for days. And he felt this vindicated his complaint about modern art that no one could tell the difference. I tried to argue why it made a big difference and why, and so on, but he wouldn't hear me. But that he was one of those artists who deeply believed in the correct codes of painting and representation. So his imitating this colonial painting becomes a different version of colonialism. It is, art in the age of mechanical reproduction. It's this whole kind of, anyway, I've given you a URL and an essay on copying for those of you interested in this. But I tell you all this because the poems refer to these things. Now, as usual, I will indicate which is mine and which is Charmaine's. It's quite a long yarn. We have time to do probably this. You can tell me when you want question time. I'm interruptible at any point. I'm not bothered. I ain't bothered. It's all good. Art yarn. So not art conversation, art yarn. For those of you not familiar with the word yarn, yarning is swapping stories, telling a story, not relying on having to prove the facts, but the facts are evident in the storytelling. People may equate yarn with untruth. We equate yarn with total truth. It's in that sense that, like the Jackie Huggins thing of having to prove that an authority doesn't have to be a library, museum, archive, textual authority from colonial authorities, but it can be a member of family who holds vast knowledge. They are authority. They are archive, a more liberated version of archive. So that's the term I use, yarning. So I start, so JK to start with. So I'm JK and Charmaine CPG. My maternal grandfather was an artist who was a signwriter. On commission and under the eye of the public, he painted the giant Queen Elizabeth for the 1954 royal visit and the giant Captain Cook with map of New Holland for the 200th celebrations. These lines, read on their own, state facts. The rest of the facts are implied. I expect implication from art. What these massive portraits stuck up on the buildings in the terrace, not a symbol, but the act of retaining its symbolic, imply, beyond drawing attention to monumental occasions of imperialism, is painting as diversion. Grandpa was highly skilled at his job. He migrated from London at 12 in 1913, just before the war, and kept London in his head all his life. Everybody liked Bob. His brush only did part of the talking. Now Charmaine responds to that. And the disjunctions are loud. My maternal grandfather was a station hand. He went to Perth in the 1950s. He had tuberculosis. I never heard of him doing any paintings, but his daughter, Auntie Mary, was a magical bark painter, stripping tree bark using Indian ink and pressed flowers. Auntie created the most beautiful bark paintings. Mullewa CWA hosted her exhibition in Mullewa. Auntie was also a station housemaid as a young woman, just like her mother and older sisters were back then. Mum said they both served the Governor-General out at Mililia Station, dressed in white hats and white aprons. I wonder if they dreamt of creating art or paintings. I wonder if they could dream of being creative in those times. I don't need to say anything. Okay, then I come back. I don't know what to do with the saying I hear sometimes that art comes to you from someone else, because I wonder which bit of art it refers to, or whether it just means some kind of skill set or sensibility, a way of seeing or not seeing, like a musical family or a family of writers. I wonder about traits of circumstance, say things people would not claim as theirs, or push aside embarrassedly with, there wasn't much choice, it was just the way things were back then. And I think, well, the way things are now isn't great, and I don't accept that and don't want to see pictures that glorify the things that aren't so great. But I am lucky as well, because my brother, who got the gift, has never seen things the way heredity would have them play out, and with skills and visions of his own devising, finds a path through that doesn't get lost in trying to find himself in someone else's pictures, or as they see it. I'm not saying art doesn't happen in families, it often does, but it doesn't have to always happen in a certain way, or that an artist who follows another artist is necessarily the same. Though sometimes there can be many good reasons and needs for cultural and familial passing down of skills and knowledge, with inflections of difference. But colonial mindsets passing on colonial views make no pictures I want in my head, and the artists in the family agree. What comes out speaks. Where am I? Okay. Charmaine responds. Hey, John, I haven't heard that saying before, and now it has me thinking about what this could mean. Was it for the person who just wanted to admire others' art? Was it for the person who felt they couldn't create art? Is this for the curators in the world working with creators? Is this for the buyer wanting to decorate their homes, or the cashed up collector looking for an art investment? I know the saying art comes from deep within you, telling storylines of feelings, ideas, belief, and connections. The storytellers exhale their innermost thoughts onto canvas, paper, carving, weaving, using their mara to create the guru, then sees paintings, baskets, lyrics, drawings. Is this what is meant by art coming to you from someone else? A colonial mindset proudly carrying on colonial views of the fine arts only originating from Europe is the authentic art, the oil painting, sculptures, and the grand architecture. Is this what it means by art coming to you from someone else? Is someone else meaning another culture, a Western one? And Aboriginal art is seen as something else altogether different. Thank goodness that is only a colonial mindset sitting on the museum, art gallery, and library shelves, slowly gathering dust. For the exhibition walls, galleries, and private collections hold Western Australian Aboriginal artists' creations in high regard. A few years back, I walked into National Gallery Australia's colonial room with its walls wrapped in colonial paintings and colonial portraits, and I had this overwhelming feeling of suffocation, suppression, and my mind was painting a picture I did not want in my head, John. That room belongs somewhere else. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself in the middle of this yarn, and I'm going to turn further on in the handout you've got to two little poems called about landscape painting. Mine's called Landscape Art, Charmaine's called Landscape Art Response. This whole issue of if you see something, you go out the West Australian wheat belt, of which there's 3% or less of the original vegetation when colonialism began its project in 1829 in Western Australia. Well, in fact, earlier than that, because it started in Albany some years before that. Perth, the Swan River colony was founded at that point. So let's look back to that. From that point on, so at the end of the 1820s, through to the present day, less than 3%, maybe 2.5% of the original vegetation of the massive area called the wheat belt, which is as large as France, is gone. It's 97%, at least 98% has been bulldozed, removed, burnt, pulled down using balls and chains, huge metal balls with chains on either side that were originally dragged by horse teams, just pulling the scrub over. As a result of this, salinity that had been lodged in the soil over millennia, millions of years, in fact, from the winds off the sea, the water table rose and they cleared the scrub. Very dry place, great irony. water table rose, and large areas are scalded by salt now and can't be farmed because they are saline. A lot of what I write about in my poetry is that saline landscape, because the family farm, my uncle and auntie's farm, wheatlands, was deeply affected by it. That's another story. But when this point of landscape, when someone goes out to paint these kind of places, so an artist goes out for the weekend to sets their easel up and they paint a portrait of these places, do their landscape art, they are naturally painting erasure. They might not know they're painting it in the Hodja-Mishra paranoid reading sense. A paranoid reading of any of these straightforward landscape paintings by a non-Indigenous artist would inevitably show, but not show, because unless you know how to look, you wouldn't see it, this erasure. So these two poems are in some ways about that. So I'm going to read them. So that's an intervention, if you like. Mine's called Landscape Art, and Charmaine's called Landscape Art Response. I should say I haven't been privileging my reading then Charmaine. I've structured it this way out of a kind of respect issue of taking responsibility for my own words. So I'm not trying to create a hierarchy of yarning, not at all. What I'm trying to do is take responsibility for my culpability. This is the purpose of this. Landscape art. So I speak. The problem begins with the notion of outdoors. I just interrupt myself again. Australians are really huge on this idea of outdoors. The outdoor life, where you go and get fit and sunburnt, so you get melanoma cancers later in life, and you strut around on the beach, and you be macho, and you that was visceral. That makes me shudder. It's ill, and this Australia is still built on this shit. Ask Russell. It's still built on these kind of really basic tropes of masculinity, colonial masculinity. It's hideous. Anyway. Hear me, Australia. Anyway, so that's outdoors. You go outdoors for that purpose, as opposed to outdoors being a concept of, say, the natural world or of freedom from harassment or any of these kind of things. Outdoors is quite specific. And in this, it has a quote mark around it. So I'll go back, start again. Landscape art. The problem begins with the notion of outdoors, the separation of house of world from house as dwelling, walls that split horizons, that divide hills and valleys, that sandbag or train the river's chosen path, as if a set of techniques in rendering how it is seen as much as conveyed, the surface photosensitive, the play of light tweaked via levels of colour, the saturation of exposure, and the easing of vegetation and topography into shapes that suggest, as if we were there too, without doors or frames in the way, a brushing and scraping into perspective, keeping the ghosts out, but not moodiness, to prevent it being read as fantastical, sullying the ambience of open air as paint fumes overwhelm proportion, distort the trained or even self-taught eye. The problem begins with rendering what you see authentically. The whole issue of authentication in art is one that fascinates us both. Now, this is Charmaine's response. It answers in its own terms. She mentions Namatjira, the famous Australian Indigenous artist who really, and I don't use the word bridged I use the word bridge with big quotation marks, because I don't mean bridge as in this nice convenient joining to bring things, separate halves together in a comfortable way. I don't mean that sort of bridge at all. But Namatjira fused for particular purposes of his own Western ways of painting with Indigenous perception. And so his art is often extremely popular among quite conservative and colonial art collectors, because they see it as a kind of, they view it in a primitivist version of European art, where it's one of the most sophisticated, incredible new ways of seeing and extensions of an old way of seeing of all art. They're magnificent artists who transcends all of these kind of impositions of what it is in terms of representational art and landscape art. Anyway, this is Charmaine's poem. Landscape art response. The problem includes the notions of nature, outdoors, and a wilderness belonging to a different window to view. When sitting in the same space and dreaming of being outside, I never did like landscape art, except for Namatjira and the Noongar landscape art movement. But in recent years, I've looked into colonial landscapes to see what stories existed in this type of art. For First Nations people's existence, or did these artists paint landscapes just as an offering to the highest bidder who wanted an extra window to gaze into? There must have been some lovely love, surely. The type of love I speak of is that I see and hear Shane Pickett speak of through his landscape country art when he said, "It is from the landscape that all our culture and beliefs come." And there is the difference for me. Okay, colonial artists constructed as a window. Colonial artists producing something largely often to take back to the home country, so-called. The colonial artist painting in Australia, who then takes it back to Britain to give a window, a glimpse into this fantastical world that, of course, is someone's real world, very real world, a stolen world. And Charmaine configures this through Shane Pickett, whose painting we just saw, and two poems I read related to one of those paintings. He says it is from the landscape that all our culture and beliefs come. Now, landscape is an interesting word. Landschaften, you get it, well, its origins probably Germanic. The idea of how we see a natural space as constructed by the human gaze, and usually by human interaction. So landscape is a constructed space. When he uses the term here, it is from landscape that our cultural beliefs come, it has two interesting prongs to it. One is that he's referring to country on one level, just as country, but the other thing is he's referring to also post-colonial country, because Noongar Budja never ceases being Noongar Budja. The artist, a well-known Indigenous artist once said to me, Julie Dowling, I said to her, would that still be country, sacred country, if someone dropped a nuclear bomb on it, incidentally, which the British did in Australia, at Maralinga and Emu Plains, 6 of them, and other bits around the place in that area. And there was a huge crater there, a ground burst rather than air burst bomb, and there was nothing there. It was just one big hole. And she said it will always be sacred country. You remove it, it'll still be sacred country. So you think in terms of dimensions, you're missing the whole point of what's being talked about. So that landscaping of country can't take country away. The other thing that Charmaine mentions in this, which I find really, really fascinating, is when she says, when dreaming of being outside, I never did like landscape art, except for Namatjira and the Noongar landscape art movement. But in recent years, I've looked into colonial landscapes to see what stories existed in this type of art. So what she looks for are the stories. And what do those stories usually tell? Well, like the one I just showed you, which is early 20th century, people would call that mid to late colonial. I call it early colonial because I think Australia has not even got to a mid-colonial stage. It's still in early colonialism. It hasn't moved out of it. It's in that phase. Is that the kind of stories that are being told are those stories that cancel out her stories. So what does that mean if you think of Prop and Todorov and folk tales and stories? If you want to reduce it to a kind of European structuralist view of things, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how a story is passed on and told? The attempt of Australian landscape painting, non-Indigenous landscape painting, has been to deviate the nature of those stories, to create new myths, to create new origins of stories. And Charmaine's saying, I want to look beyond those and find what the real stories are. And the stories you usually find are quite horrifying, which brings us back to the issue of environment and the issue of responsibility as an environmental activist to always consult Indigenous knowledge and to hear the Indigenous stories that Indigenous speakers wish to share, not the ones that they don't wish to share, the ones they wish to share. So, for example, in 2016, I was involved with many others, thousands of others, in a protest to stop a highway through the Bilio wetlands in Perth. Incredibly unique wetlands in the world, one of the diversity hotspots of the world, in the middle of a city. And this government wanted to build a highway right through the middle of it, of course. A protracted, this has been going on for some years, but when the big protests came, and eventually it was stopped after a lot of damage was done, but actually succeeded, the protest succeeded, it was stopped, is that there was an ongoing consultation with Wajak Noongar elders who set up camp on site, and people were able to go and talk to them and negotiate how they could be activists in a way that was respectful. That empowered everything. It stopped it. It couldn't have stopped it without that consultation. It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. From an environmental point of view, it's total ignorance and stupidity not to consult the people whose country it's been for 40 or 50,000 years, who are the repositories of a data system so complex that no computer, no AI could match, because it is interpersonal, intertextual with land, country. Its codes are highly rarefied through centuries and centuries of passing on verbally and through signs and through many manifestations of culture. So you cannot be an environmentalist in Australia and succeed in stopping damage to the biosphere without consulting and working with Indigenous knowledge holders. It's impossible. You violate the space, you don't save it. So this is really why I've come in through this way, and the visual representations of place are all important to how we act around place. So we walk through a gallery and we see all these colonial paintings, and we come out the end and I say, oh, that was just a bunch of colonial painting, which it is. If we haven't actually looked in, as Charmaine did, for the stories they tell or don't tell, we are also missing bits that have been knocked out of Indigenous knowledges that have been erased by colonialism, that are often retrieved by Indigenous people themselves and rebuilt and reconstituted. But they also have to rely on things like national archives. They have to rely on births and death records. They have to rely on the tools of imperialism to actually rebuild knowledge bases from the bits that are missing. So in a sense, when we walk through the colonial gallery and we look, we're also looking at things that aren't supposed to be seen, that colonial artists weren't even aware, and if they were aware, didn't certainly want to sell that way. And Charmaine constantly refers to sale. She constantly refers to the monetarisation of painting, which she very clearly is working against. So we look in a different way. There's a responsibility to look at these things in some ways. Okay, how are we on the time? We're stopped. We're finished. Okay, I'm finished. Not finished. I'm not finished.
Can I ask two questions?
Yeah.
I think these might be questions in the room.
My glasses on, people who have known know this problem. No. Yeah.
Two questions that are sort of there in almost everything you say, and terms that might not be familiar to everyone, but I think if you can unpack them, that'll unpack a lot of what was implicit. The first is, what is country? And the second is, why is Australia an apartheid state?
Okay, very easy, sadly, to answer both. Well, it's good to answer the first one. The second one, I'm sad to have to answer. First one, what is country? The land, what many of us might term land, and what many of us might term a region or an area that we are ancestrally connected with, is for Indigenous peoples in Australia, and I'm talking specifically about Noongar and Yamatji people here in Western Australia, is country. It's all your relationships to that land and to that environment and to that quiddity, if you like, that unseeable connection. The relationship isn't a relationship of ownership. You don't own the land in a sense. To use a cliche, the land owns you. And it's not that simple either, because the relations are variable and they rely on complex sets of totemics, personal relationships to, say, a person, to an animal or to a plant or so on. There are all many different complexities, and I can't speak for those. But country, in essence, is the ancestral sacred land. And this is constantly violated. One of the big themes of this book, False Claims, Colonial Thieves, is around a colonial architect in the mid-20th or early 20th to almost mid-20th century, a guy called Hawes, Monsignor Hawes. And Monsignor Hawes was originally an Anglican priest who converted to Catholicism, went to, via other colonial outposts, quotation marks, ended up in Western Australia, where he built this set of remarkable looking churches out of local materials in the Midwest of Western Australia on country. In building these remarkable buildings, one of which is an illustration Charmaine and her son Mark Smith did on the front cover. So that's the cathedral in Geraldton, the Catholic Cathedral in Geraldton. Of course, were built out of stone and materials taken out of country, which is what people who love to fetishize these buildings say so remarkable, look like they're part of the landscape, as they say. What they are the theft of sacred places. And in the case of one in Mullewa, where Charmaine grew up and refers to in those early grandmother poems, the stones actually came from a specifically sacred place, from a place of worship, from a place where the local Indigenous people would go and have ceremonies and so on, and they hacked the stone out of these outcrops and stuff. Incredible, and built a church, a Christian church out of it. So country is everything, and country then being turned into church remains country, stolen country. So it's not a one-dimensional or even two or even three-dimensional thing. It's a highly complex negotiation of space, ancestry, skin connection, language, and totemic belonging. Second question, the apartheid that is Australia. Well, where do we begin? Australia, as you all know, was originally a set of accruing colonies. And it wasn't federated until the beginning of the 20th century. One of the first laws enshrined by the Australian Parliament was the White Australia policy. Yeah, it is what it sounds, the White Australia policy. That policy wasn't overturned for many, many, many decades. And basically it was to control on the surface labour and to control markets, as these things often are, but its essence was an apartheid. It was the basis of Australian apartheid. In the 1967 referendum, and the recognition of Indigenous rights to be counted in the census in Australia. Prior to that, it wasn't the case. Each state varied, so it's not a simple picture, it's a complex picture. But in essence, Aboriginal people weren't identified as citizens and lacked many of the rights that other Australians had in their capacity as Indigenous peoples. The whole structure of, and there's a long timeline of this, I teach in my Indigenous poetry course, and I don't have time to go through it now, but there are a whole set of laws and emplacements. In Perth, for example, up until well into the 50s and 60s, there was a curfew law, which Aboriginal people weren't allowed to be in the centre of the city after 8 o'clock at night. There was a wonderful music club that in Perth in this period where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people made music and blurred the edges of the curfew and so on. And there's all sorts of stories of defying these things. You've got to understand, Australia's a cosmopolitan place now. Every nation and people on the planet and somewhere else representing Australia. But power resides in the colonial structures of governance. They're enshrined in the laws. And an attempt even to have an advisory body to the Australian Parliament, the Voice, as it was called, was just recently outvoted in the referendum. Australians overwhelmingly chose not to have that kind of advisory body. It generally suits colonial power to perpetuate the model that's made us wealthy and made it wealthy. And you think in a diverse incoming migration, and it is a diverse migration increasingly, thank goodness, you'd think that that would break it down, but it doesn't, because power protects power, wealth protects wealth, and people want to get what wealth they can. And the people always suffer are the Indigenous Australians who, every time anything benefit comes their way, it's reported in the paper as they're getting something extra. That's actually called racism by the right-wing politicians in Australia, because you're favouring Aboriginal people, even though it was their country, it's stolen, and a vast number of people were murdered, and death in custodies are massive, and the prison populations largely consists of Indigenous people, though it's only 3% of the population, 3 to 4% of the population, at most 5, and so on and so on. That is an embodied apartheid. So it's not just a figurative apartheid. There are laws and there are rejections of laws that would, and things that would enhance Aboriginal lives that are overturned or rebuffed in so many ways. Does that answer your question, Russell? You can make this a very long answer because it is a long, it's a long parliamentary legislative journey. And each state's different, and each state has its version of the horror. Yeah. If you have any questions, feel free, because otherwise I just keep reading and talking, because I'm happy to discuss whatever you want. And if you put it in the environmental context, by all means, yes.
So I also noticed that there is a pattern as to how the points are being written, in the sense that, like for example, if you talk about grandmothers or moonlight medicine and giving water to our art landscape. So the sequence is such that you go first, Ron will go first, and Charmaine will follow. The response is from Charmaine. So it's
always though, not through the whole works. Sometimes they're flipped, and usually what it came out of in terms of our interaction was I would say, well, Charmaine would say to me, or I'd say to Charmaine, whoever instigated something, it might be best for you to speak first, John, because then I can respond. So in a sense, the response gives an ability to really show where the wrongs are in the original, because for all I try, and I'm still constructed through my antecedents as much as I reject them. And don't take for a moment, my rejection is not a love for family or something. I love my family as much as anyone else, but I am the product of a particular colonial project, and very much so. And so that is something that is always in our discussions and negotiations about order and how we go about things. Something's always discussed. So it's never random.
Can you, Monica, can you speak up with the questions, because the students online can't hear the questions? Raise your voice for them.
Yeah, so I was just looking at this from the point of because you mentioned the aim of this writing is also this art, this work is also to address and rectify, in terms of colonialism, and also I'm looking at from the perspective of gender, like how writers.
Yeah, well, that's an extremely important thing too. We have a lot of things we negotiate, and an interesting thing, when this book first came out, there was some quite disturbing responses in the public, in which Charmaine noted and commented on. In fact, there's a recording, I think, on the ABC National Radio you can find online, where she talks about this, how I was presented as the august white professor, and she was represented as the Indigenous writer. And there was a clear hierarchizing and privileging of discussion. Now that was quickly fixed. That was because I wouldn't participate, and it was wrong and humiliating. Her achievements far outweigh mine in so many ways it's beyond comprehension. But the social structure of discussion is set up to privilege in certain ways, and it still is. I mean, the right wing peddle these kind of myths that there's the loss of the white male voice and all this. It's a lot of rubbish. The white male voice is entirely privileged, and it will be for a long time. It works in subtle ways at times to get round certain barriers that it sees coming up. But this is intrinsic to the Australian media and intrinsic to the way things are discussed. Is it changing? Yes, I think it is. And I think that this kind of, and Charmaine, with a doctorate and all the things that she's got in terms of those things that structure values, they kind of process in a different way. This is the way they process me. And she's directed that. She's talked about it, written against it, and highlighted the problem with it. So there's a gendering in there. There's also a social privileging. There's an ethnic privileging. There's a colonial privileging. The gender thing's particularly interesting because, of course, there are things that can't be discussed and shouldn't be discussed within certain structures of conversation in any Indigenous community. But Charmaine's always been someone that speaks what she wants to speak, and she speaks with her community, and she speaks as herself as well. and where those things cross over is complex. So what I am doing around them is I'm looking at appropriate points of entry where it is welcome and not where I think it might be convenient for me to enter the conversation. All of those things are constantly being negotiated. They have to be. They always will be. Yeah.
To be honest, I'm not sure you're going to like my question, but I would really be interested in your opinion, because earlier said that you would like to give all the country back to the indigenous.
I wouldn't use the word give, I'd say return.
Return, sorry. Yeah. And I would just be interested because in Germany, there's also a big discussion about how can our generation be guilty for something that our ancestors did that we never connected with. And also we have this whose land is it discussion in Israel and Palestine. And I was wondering, I definitely agree with you that we need to be aware of privileges and of colonial power structures and everything. So I definitely agree with you that right now the power structures are not as they should be. But I was wondering, wouldn't it be, well, more fair to like come together on an equal point and discuss what the land, what will happen with the land, because you were born on the land as well, you didn't steal it. So wouldn't it also be unfair to...
I can answer your question. It's a really easy one for me to answer. Okay. I've been asked it many, many times. You've got to remember, when this book first came out, I got on national radio making these statements like I've made them here. And I received some of the most extreme hate you've ever seen. You know, really worrying stuff. It's not a popular position. First of all, yes, I think there's a discussion to be had, but there's no equal grounds to have it on at present. None. And it can't be had because you're always talking on stolen country. And even where country's been returned to traditional owners to live on and so on, mining companies and so on have all sorts of vetoes and ways around it. They work with Indigenous communities by splitting them very often and getting some members of the community on side, others not on side, divide and conquer kind of mentalities, very common among mining companies. The Yindjibarndi people in Western Australia dealing with the Fortescue mining company of a guy called Twiggy Forrest, they were dealing constantly with divide and conquer tactics, which are very effective. You know, you get one side of the community, you promise them a lot and to do things to support them, and the other side who refuse them, they are left, you know, a lot, and it causes ruptures and splits in the community. Now, they're for Indigenous communities to sort, not me. I don't have any right or conversation there, though I have I observe it and I write about it. That's the first thing. So there is no ever any true equal ground. So we can't just come together and discuss it because we are dominating in everything. We, the colonial inheritors, and the people who are embedded in the colonial structures. What my argument is, by a complete return, there's no Indigenous peoples I've ever known who want to throw people into the sea. That's just a furphy, a myth. Doesn't exist. But by giving certain legal rights, returning certain legal rights to country and saying that you have, you know, the right of veto, you have the right of say, everything has to be negotiated, then you start having equal conversations. So, for example, you want to build a house here, but because there's a new law that says you've got to consult with Indigenous people before you build the house, then you have to have a conversation. There's no reason why it can't be an equal conversation because they've got that right. We've got that right at the moment. So it's all a way of seeing, isn't it? It's all seeing, it's easy to see it differently if you have the power to say, well, what can't we create an equal conversation? Because there's no equal grounds. So what I'm saying is by returning the impetus of power to Indigenous peoples, then negotiations can take place on an equal way. You're talking a population of 26, 27 million people in Australia. You're talking a very small, you know, a few percent of Indigenous peoples, maybe 4 to 5% at most, 3 to 5%, is that the sheer weight of numbers suggests that there's going to be a lot of weight on one side of the conversation. So return evens that up, to my mind. So that's the answer I would give. And I thought a lot about it. And I live there, but I don't see it right. I have great discomfort with it. I love the land I live on. I write it. I've spent my life trying to defend it. But I know it's not mine. And I know I'm there under false premises, even if it's 5th generation or 6th generation, which is the case in my family. You know, the Irish side my Bob came early in the 20th century, but the rest comes from the 1850s, early 1850s. But you know, in space of 50,000 years, that's pretty recent. Having said that, I believe a migrant who goes to Australia has the same rights as me the day they arrive, or a refugee, the day they arrive as I have. Exactly. So I don't privilege myself in any way over that. I really deeply believe this. So wherever the flaws are in me, they're the flaws I write, and that's who I am. Yeah.
That maybe relates to the and you were talking before about the country, and I was just curious, what would be country for you or your country? Would it be then Ireland or?
Wow, this is the look. We moved to Ireland for a few years. In 2013, our son went to school there, learned Irish, so on. And I think my partner is also Irish heritage, and we wanted to find that out. And my answer to it is, I feel a deep attraction to the land there. People have no problem with me being there, and having no problem with me being there was my problem. Then I developed a problem. Then I felt that maybe it's not my place, because why could they not be comfortable with someone who just come from Senegal being there? And that is not the case, because maybe in Dublin, but in certain rural places of Ireland, it's like going back 1,000 years. It really is. In fact, it's an interesting thing. The most colonized country of that region by the British, by the English specifically, especially under Elizabeth and so on, from there on, the plantation period on, is quite bigoted in many ways. There's a lot of prejudice in Ireland, and I find that a problem. So I love the place, I love the country, and I get on really well with the people. They see us as blowbacks. That's how they describe us. 170 years, but blowbacks, coming home. We're coming home, but it's not my home, and it never will be unless it accepts everyone the same. And that's what home is for me. What is my country? A place of equality, diversity, sharing and respect for Indigenous culture and for the natural world. Because I'm a vegan animal rights activist too, and that's part of the picture for me as well. But I'm never going to find that place. So I kind of wander out from Jantry Gully and so on. Anyway, yeah, how are we on the time? We've still got plenty of time.
So he said that Australia is still in the process of colonization, early colonization. So for someone like us, our temporality will be different. So the British stole our land, and after centuries, they gave it back as if it was theirs to give it back to us to begin with. So and gave it back after creating a number of famines, massacres, creating a political contradiction, economy, everything. So do you think that since our colonizers are no longer in proximity with us, the colonized, do you think such conversations and such dialogues is important, but is it possible? Is it possible between a Britisher who left our country, his ancestors probably left their country 70 years ago, and us today as someone who is an Indian, but a generation who have only heard about colonization from our great-grandfather's point. My grandfather talks about independence, not of colonization, because when he was young, independence was on its way. But it also came with partition, which was again a pain. So do you think such conversation is possible when the settlers and the colonized are not in proximity? And how can that go about it? It is possible.
No, I think it has to be. I think there's no choice. I think that colonial residues persist in so many ways. I'll give you an interesting little tangential case study. There's a very, very powerful Indian mining company called Adani, who have been trying to develop the Carmichael mine in Queensland, which I campaigned against for a long time, as many others have. Massive coal mine, yeah, one of the biggest. Building new ports, destroying rivers, devastation of sacred country, death of species that are on the verge of extinction, and so on. Now, the discussion around Adani is a really interesting one in Australia, because you've got what is essentially a colonial structure from a country who removed the colonial oppressors, a fair while back, and so is not seen as a country that's engaged in the struggle of colonialism. It actually is, to my mind, in many ways, because of imperial world capitalist powers, they force a colonialism. No matter what happens, the United States and Britain and for this matter, Germany, they are still controlling the financial kind of levers of the world, which is its own colonialism. So I don't think anyone's ever free of colonial heritage. That's the first thing. With Adani, and this is the second thing, the discussion around Adani is really interesting because people don't, who are have been trying to combat it, don't know how to position their argument. Because on the one hand, because most of the people involved in the process are anti-colonial, they're interested in decolonisation. Now here's an Indian company coming into Australia, not an Anglo-American company or the usual, or the Canadian, French, or whoever usually comes in and does this. It's an Indian company, so they must have, so the thinking goes, a knowledge of the experience of colonialism. So therefore they must behave differently. They can't behave like these big American giants and these big, but they don't. They behave like a mining company. They behave according to capitalism. So what's driving them is capitalism, not the fact that they may have particularities within the company that are specifically Indian and draw on Indian experience, but in the end, they're worried about the market and they're operating under market forces. That market is colonial. They're operating within a larger colonial capitalist structure. So my argument is there's never any escape as long as capitalism, and so I suppose my ultimate bugbear is capitalism, as long as it exists as the overwhelming narrative, the grandest of narratives, if you like, as long as it exists, any colonial residues, any colonial previous experience can never really be overcome. Then it becomes even more essential to have those conversations with when you're not in proximity, to create a kind of vicarious proximity of conversation, so you can work out how best mutually to overturn the even bigger problem, which is capitalism. So that's how I'm an anarchist. That's how I see the world. You know, I see a stateless world where everyone shares property. The only property I have any respect for is the kind of, and in India too, indigenous association with country. I respect that totally. But that's a different thing. It's not a capitalist association of land. It's a totemic, and all those things of country. And yeah, so these things are complex. So there's no simple answer, but they're things in my critical writing I've tried to methodically answer across all my critical books. So I don't try and leave loose ends. If I see a loose end, I explore it and try and find out how that fits in correcting these wrongs. So I see India in a state of ongoing resistance to colonialism. I don't think it's divorced from colonialism at all. And I think that the big colonial structures are still in place, even over a company like Adani, which would see itself as incredibly powerful in making its own decisions. But it's not. The market makes its decisions. Yeah. So
That is in the process of taking away lands from indigenous populations.
I know.
Yes.
Yes, I know. And that's something I've been tracking as well and writing about and so on. But I mean, you know, this is all got to be joined up in the conversation. This is our responsibility. Russell, you want to?
There's a number of questions that have come out of the chat.
This will be interesting.
Yeah, same problem. Now, there's one here. There's one right at the beginning. Amit asks, can you discuss the challenges or criticisms faced by eco-protest poetry in the global South and how poets navigate those issues?
Oh, well, now you've really opened Pandora's box, because what I'm mostly known as and described as is an eco-poet, but I reject the label. It, to me, has a kind of fetishizing control thing around it of compartmentalizing, putting into absorbable university discourse and so on. I think that if we're going to truly try and as a pacifist as well, obviously I don't. My struggles are not violent ones; they're always non-violent ones. If we're going to resist in always possible and bring people to a point where there is an equitable sharing of the wealth that is less damaging to the planet, then we're going to have to actually work beyond the structures such as eco-poet and so on, because I think implicitly we all have to be, as poets, ecologically concerned. Those who identify as eco-poets do so very often for very positive reasons, because they want the camaraderie, the collectivity, and the strength that comes in numbers. So if you're going to get a bunch of eco-poets together trying to stop the very small area of the Shungbuk forest that's actually protected as a native wildlife sanctuary, people don't realise it's actually an incredibly few percent, very small percent. If you've got people, then the eco-poets can do a particularly good job, focus, and they can coordinate resources and so on. So there's a logic behind the whole eco-poetry movement. But from my point of view, as an environmental activist poet, which is how I describe myself, an environmental activist and a human rights activist and an animal rights activist who happens to be a poet and who uses poetry in all things as a kind of tool to stop damage if I can, is the way I see it, is that the definition is almost irrelevant. It's one of those things that's just a collective gathering term. I think that we need to critique eco-poetry as becoming somewhat, once again, it's a capitalist motif. It's highly fetishized. It has it's a marketing tool, and we need to resist those things. We need to, if we care about the global south, we care about equality and the fairer sharing of things in the world and the reduction of inequalities in all different ways, then in a sense, an eco-poet can't do it. Because an eco-poet who self-describes as an eco-poet has already in a sense taken a step into the realm of elites. And yeah, so I'm an environmentalist poet. I used to refute the term nature poet, which I used to be called. And that used to annoy me because of the American kind of Emersonian tradition of nature that I found very minimalizing. In more recent years, I've engaged with it more in a different way by using it differently. But that always bothered me, as if something is nature's there for humans to actually fetishize and aestheticize and turn into curatorial objects called poems or bits of art or whatever. I reject all that. Although I'm concerned about all these intersectionalism. Well, I suppose I'm so intersected that I'm just one big lots of cross lines because there's nothing separable. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question it's a mixture partly from Brazil and partly from Mexico. The case of Australia is very similar to that of Brazil. But here, Brazil, there is the problem of the deep mixing of race. We understand, Tay, that the Quilombolas, people who live in the spaces of Black resistance, also own the land. And on top of that, there is a problem of white Brazilians seeing themselves as white people in a European idea. Odette says Mexico is similar, and Jessica asked, in Mexico, do you see yourselves as Latin Americans? Here, the vast majority of the population see themselves as very separated part of this, or don't even understand that we are alike. So there's a dialogue going on there between Brazil and Mexico.
And what do you want me to respond to specifically?
Have you nothing to say on this topic?
I've got something to say on every topic. Well, first of all, because I come at these things from this strange intersectional matrix I've been talking about, and as someone who deeply values, to use a very easy word, diversity in all things, which I do. I am a pluralist. I believe in intercultural conversations that are respectful to the ideations of those specific cultural origins and those. So it's a complex Venn diagram. For me, the first thing is, because I don't believe in property or land, there's one problem that already doesn't exist conceptually. It's, people often ask me about, you can read on our blog mutually several the things I've written about what's going on in Gaza. But people have for many years said to me, and I've written a chapter of my book Legibility and Anti-Fascist Poetics, which came out last year with Palgrave, is that I have a chapter on Palestine and Israel, taken from the perspective of an anarchist, pacifist vegan, someone who doesn't believe in property, who doesn't believe in ownership, but believes in the integrity of connection with country, is how do you negotiate these kind of specific differences that give concentrations outside the usual binaries of power and interest? How do you negotiate those? Well, you negotiate them, to my mind, through consensus and communalism. So different peoples with different origins, different ethnicities, different spiritual connections are ecumenical. They converse. I wrote a play once for at Churchill College, where I am in Cambridge. I wrote a play for them. They've got a chapel that was built there. It's an ecumenical chapel. And the story is, because the college was founded by scientists or for science, it didn't want to have a religious institution on the grounds of the college. So the Chapel Society got hold of a bit of land that connects with the college next to it and built their chapel there, and made it an ecumenical chapel. I wrote a play for that chapel some years ago called Ecumenical. And the point it makes is that you can have places that are weighted in one direction. So in that particular space, it's obviously weighted towards Christianity. You can have a place that's weighted towards one particular ideation. That can then be even secularized. It can be made different through the participation of many other people. So the way I see all kind of complexities of ideation and identity in any space is through constant mixing and conversation. I call this international regionalism. That's the little coinage I came up with 30 years ago. And what it means is respecting regional integrity while encouraging international kind of dialogues and discourses, which reduced to the local space means that we may all have very different views, but we are in one room. That negotiation's already begun. And when you think of country concepts like Brazil, Australia, Mexico, there's one collectivity already created artificially and under usually extremely dire circumstances. So you start with that embodiment as your place of potential consensus. And then you work to reduce it, make it, as an anarchist always does, smaller and smaller and smaller. So you're into smaller component parts that then communicate with other component parts. So it's all a matter of scale. These discussions are best had small scale, then they can apply in a larger molecular way. Yeah.
Okay, we really do have to wind up, I'm afraid. We do have to wind up, unless, because there's one more question online we won't have time for, unless you can ask a question that can be answered within the space of 30 seconds.
About apartheid, like as an apartheid country. So I would like to ask, what are the complete solutions to giving the voice to indigenous people, and also what is the role of poetry in engaging in those kind of discussions and changing that narrative?
Well, I think poetry is at the center of everything. I actually believe that. I believe it's one of the mediums of change that is most dynamic across all history. Word of mouth, call and response, whatever version it is. Poetry is the impacting of language with the essentials of the moment, and to history too. It can bring it all into play. In Australia, of course, the trying to bring the voice to Parliament was an attempt to do that. It was rejected. It should also be said that it was campaigned against not only by the usual right-wing horrors who won out, but it was actually campaigned against by a minority of Indigenous people who felt it didn't go far enough and they wanted the treaty structure. So that was a whole different debate. It was also campaigned against by Indigenous people who held right-wing positions within colonial governance, and that's a whole different debate as well. So I'm not trying to homogenise the discussion, and to, it's far more complex than that. But really, from my point of view, in terms of how I think there can be actually concrete redress, is I think that the only way is non-participation in the state is to refuse everything it has. Now, they will crush everything in front of them. That's what states do. But I have found in my own life, in being locked up and all the rest of the things that have happened in my life as a protester, is non-compliance. And, I think Thoreau in Civil Disobedience didn't go far enough, and he was really obsessed with taxation. That was his obsession. So it's a big problem, that document. But the principle, I agree. Civil disobedience is a very, very useful thing. I wrote a set of poems that are in my selected poems, early selected poems called Peripheral Light, that are about, they're called linguistic disobedience. There's 10 of them, and they're about using language to be disobedient in every way possible. And I think that many of the fantastic Indigenous poets in Australia, and much of the terrific poetry written in Australia is by Indigenous poets, not entirely, of course, but there are many really powerful Indigenous poets in Australia, is they are doing that. They're changing the language of discussion. It's seeping out into the community before the community completely understands what's going on. So the white power structures are trying to, accommodate it and trying to work out, and they will recognise by giving them an award or something, but what they're not understanding is that it's actually changing their language too. And that's how poetry really can bring change, really practical, pragmatic, practical change.
Okay, so thank you, John. Thank you to
My
all of
pleasure.
you for joining in. Thank you to those of you who are online. Sorry if we didn't fit in all the questions, because we could keep on discussing for hours on end, in fact. But these sort of things will continue to resonate and reverberate, and John Kinsella will be back at some point in the not too far distant future.
Thank
So,
you.
thank you, everyone. See you next week.
You too.